Christmas morning, 10 a.m. sharp, the kind of hour when leagues expect silence, not chaos. Phones usually stay untouched, inboxes go quiet, and executives assume, at least for one day, that nothing unexpected will blow up in their faces. That illusion didn't even make it to noon, because without warning, without coordination, and without asking anyone for approval, Nike dropped a 32-second commercial that instantly rewired the power conversation in women's basketball. What looked harmless on the surface was anything but. This wasn't a feel-good holiday ad, it was a message, and the people it was aimed at felt it immediately. The star of that message was Caitlin Clark, and within seconds of the video going live, it became obvious this wasn't another polished endorsement folded neatly into league marketing plans. There was no build-up, no press coordination, no polite heads-up. One moment it was Christmas morning, the next, social media feeds were flooded with a cinematic spectacle featuring celebrities, high-budget visuals, and a global tone that felt miles away from traditional women's basketball promotion. And what made it even louder was what you didn't see. No league logos, no collective messaging, no subtle nods to shared growth. Just Clark, front and center, positioned like a cultural force that didn't need institutional backing to matter. That silence landed harder than any statement ever could, because while fans were replaying the ad and celebrating what it represented, leadership inside the WNBA was dealing with a different reality. Reports suggest phones started buzzing immediately. Confusion set in. Questions flew. How did this go live without coordination? Why didn't anyone know? And most importantly, what did it mean when the league's most visible athlete could generate a viral moment of this magnitude without the league being part of the story at all? What was supposed to be a quiet holiday suddenly felt like a public stress test for who actually holds influence. What made this moment so jarring wasn't just the scale of the commercial, it was the timing. Holidays are strategic safe zones. Executives count on them. Media attention is usually elsewhere. Crises wait their turn. But this didn't wait. Dropping it on Christmas morning guaranteed maximum visibility and minimum resistance. Families were home, screens were on, sports fans were scrolling, and Nike knows exactly how moments travel online. This wasn't accidental exposure, it was precision placement. And the message traveled fast. This star doesn't need permission to dominate the conversation. Underneath the festive optics was something much sharper. For months, tension had been building quietly between individual star power and organizational control. That tension didn't start on Christmas Day, but that's when it became impossible to ignore. When one athlete can hijack an entire holiday news cycle without league approval, the balance shifts whether anyone wants to admit it or not. And that realization is unsettling for institutions built on collective structure, shared narratives, and centralized authority. By the time the holiday calm was supposed to settle back in, it was already gone. Not replaced with outrage, at least not publicly, but with unease. Because once viewers start asking who actually benefits from moments like this, and once sponsors demonstrate they don't need league clearance to generate massive attention, the conversation changes permanently. Christmas morning wasn't peaceful, it was revealing, and what it revealed would ripple far beyond a single commercial. There's an unspoken rule in professional sports that everyone at the executive level understands. Holidays aren't just days off, they're pressure release valves. They're the rare windows when controversy slows down, when emails stop flying, and when leadership can assume nothing explosive will suddenly demand immediate answers. Christmas Day, in particular, is considered untouchable territory, not because of tradition, but because of timing. Most decision-makers are off-grid, media desks are thinly staffed, and fans are distracted by family, travel, and other leagues. It's the closest thing sports organizations get to a guaranteed pause, which is exactly why what happened next felt so deliberate. When Nike released that commercial on Christmas morning, they weren't ignoring the calendar, they were exploiting it. Brands with that level of media intelligence don't accidentally choose dates, they calculate them. Christmas guarantees massive screen time. Phones are always nearby.
Social feeds are constantly refreshed, and unlike a normal weekday drop, there's almost no institutional defense ready to respond. No coordinated statements, no rapid PR pivots, just reaction. That's why many industry observers believe this timing was less about celebration and more about control. If you want a message to land without interference, you release it when no one can stop it. What made the move even sharper is what it bypassed. The WNBA had every reason to expect calm. The season was over. Months of controversy had already drained public attention. Leadership reportedly hoped for one quiet day where women's basketball wouldn't dominate headlines for the wrong reasons. Let the NFL own Christmas. Let the NBA take the spotlight. Let the league breathe. Instead, the entire conversation snapped back instantly, and this time it was happening on someone else's terms. Reports suggest league leadership had no advance warning, no courtesy note, no early screening, no chance to shape the narrative. That detail matters because in modern sports business, messaging is everything. When organizations know what's coming, they can prepare language, signal unity, or at least pretend alignment. When they don't, silence becomes the story. And on Christmas morning, silence was exactly what followed, at least from official channels. The gap between the commercial's global reach and the league's absence from the moment didn't feel accidental to fans. It felt pointed.
There's also a psychological layer here that rarely gets discussed publicly. Releasing something disruptive on a holiday doesn't just create attention, it creates vulnerability. Decision-makers aren't in the same room, advisors are harder to reach, reactions become fragmented, and once a narrative runs for hours without response, it hardens. By the time leadership regroups, the audience has already decided what the moment meant. And in this case, many viewers interpreted the timing as a statement of independence, whether that was the intention or not. It also forced a comparison that institutions hate making. When a single athlete, Caitlin Clark, can dominate a holiday media cycle without league support, it exposes a power imbalance that had been quietly growing all season. The timing didn't create that imbalance, it revealed it. And once that realization settles in, it's impossible to put back in the box. Because now the question isn't why the ad dropped on Christmas. The question becomes why the league wasn't in a position to influence it at all. That's what made the timing feel less like marketing flair and more like a strategic flex. It put everyone on notice without saying a single word. And as the day went on, it became clear that the real shock wasn't the commercial itself. It was how unprepared the system was for a moment like this to happen without its consent. And once that door opens, it rarely closes quietly. The commercial didn't waste a single second trying to explain itself. From the opening frame, it made one thing clear. This wasn't designed to feel like a standard sports endorsement. The tone was cinematic, the pacing fast, the visuals deliberate. Every shot carried the weight of something bigger than basketball highlights and post-game quotes. Nike leaned into spectacle, surrounding Caitlin Clark with a level of polish usually reserved for global icons, not athletes still early in their professional careers. The message landed instantly. This wasn't an introduction, this was a coronation. What stood out immediately was the company she was kept in. Major celebrities appeared without explanation, treated as peers rather than cameos. The commercial placed Clark effortlessly alongside figures like Travis Kelce, with no hierarchy implied and no qualifiers attached. There was no narrative about building the league or lifting the game. Instead, the focus stayed locked on individual gravity, on cultural relevance, on the idea that Clark belongs in conversations far beyond women's basketball circles. The ad didn't ask viewers to believe in her potential. It assumed her dominance was already obvious. But what hit hardest wasn't who was included, it was who wasn't. There were no league visuals threaded into the storyline, no familiar branding, no acknowledgement of shared platforms or institutional support. The WNBA was effectively invisible, not even present in the background. For an organization that typically emphasizes collective recognition and league-first storytelling, that omission felt loud. It suggested that this moment didn't require validation, history, or framework. The spotlight wasn't being borrowed,
It was owned. Observers online were quick to point out how sharply this differed from traditional athlete marketing. Most league-connected endorsements are careful. They reinforce partnerships. They weave individual success into broader organizational narratives. This did the opposite. It pulled the camera tight around one athlete and refused to widen the frame. Many fans interpreted that choice as intentional, especially given how meticulously every other detail was handled. When production is this precise, nothing is accidental, not even what's left out. The absence of league branding also reframed the story the commercial was telling. Instead of presenting Clark as a representative of women's basketball, it presented her as a standalone force, someone whose journey, visibility, and appeal exist independently of any single system. That framing carries implications beyond marketing. It subtly challenges the idea that institutional affiliation is the primary driver of legitimacy. And once audiences absorb that idea, it becomes difficult to unsee it. What made the moment even more striking was how normal it felt to viewers. There was no sense of controversy baked into the presentation, no defensive language, no explanation. The ad operated on the assumption that this is simply how stars are treated when their influence reaches a certain level. And in doing so, it forced an uncomfortable comparison. If this is what independent star power looks like, what role does the league actually play when attention reaches this scale? By the time the commercial ended, the statement had already been made. It didn't criticize, it didn't confront, it didn't need to. Cutting the league out of the visual story did all the talking. And as the replay count climbed and discussion spread, it became clear that this omission wasn't just stylistic, it was structural. Because moments like this don't just celebrate athletes, they redefine who the system is built around. And that realization was only beginning to sink in.
The uncomfortable truth the league has been dancing around all season became impossible to ignore after that commercial. Caitlin Clark isn't just the most recognizable face in women's basketball right now. She's the engine driving its attention. Her games draw audiences that eclipse standard league averages. Her highlights travel faster and farther than official promotional clips. Her name alone can shift ratings, sell out arenas, and turn routine matchups into must-watch events. That kind of pull doesn't fit neatly into systems designed around shared spotlight and equal distribution. For decades, the WNBA has operated on a collectivist model. The message has always been that the league comes first, the brand is bigger than any individual, and success should be framed as communal progress rather than personal dominance. That philosophy works, until it doesn't, because when one player generates more interest than the rest of the league combined, the rules quietly start breaking. Control becomes harder to enforce. Narratives slip, and institutional authority starts competing with reality. Reports have suggested that this imbalance has been a growing headache behind closed doors. How do you promote parity when fans clearly tune in for one name? How do you manage messaging when media requests revolve around a single player? And how do you demand restraint from someone whose presence alone transforms the business outcome of a game? These aren't public debates, but they're unavoidable ones, because when value becomes concentrated, leverage follows. Clark's value isn't theoretical anymore, it's measurable. Broadcast metrics spike when she plays, ticket prices jump, merchandise moves. Even neutral viewers who don't typically follow women's basketball find themselves watching clips, discussing moments, and sharing opinions because her visibility extends beyond the sport's traditional audience. That level of reach gives an athlete something rare: options. And options change how power is negotiated, even when no one openly acknowledges it. That's why the Nike commercial felt so destabilizing. It didn't create Clark's leverage, it showcased it. It showed what happens when value bypasses institutional pipelines and flows directly to the individual. From the league's perspective, that's a nightmare scenario, because control depends on dependency. Once an athlete proves they can thrive, monetize, and dominate attention without organizational framing, the balance tilts, quietly but decisively. There's also a perception challenge layered into this tension. When leadership emphasizes unity while audiences respond to star power, it creates mixed signals. Fans don't consume sports like policy documents. They follow gravity.
They go where the excitement is, and Clark has become the gravitational center, whether anyone likes that framing or not. The league can encourage broader narratives, but it can't force audiences to divide attention evenly. What makes this dynamic so volatile is that neither side can openly confront it without consequences. Acknowledging Clark's outsized value risks undermining the league's foundational philosophy. Ignoring it risks falling out of step with reality. And somewhere in that tension sits an athlete whose visibility continues to grow regardless of how it's managed. That's the paradox leadership is trapped in. And after Christmas morning, it became clear that pretending the scales are balanced is no longer an option. Because once power becomes visible, it's no longer negotiable. Once the initial shock wore off, the real damage started to register behind the scenes. Publicly, there was no immediate response, no statements, no pushback, just silence. But according to reports circulating around league circles, that quiet didn't mean calm, it meant confusion. Phones lit up, group chats filled, emergency calls started happening between people who weren't expecting to work at all that morning. What was supposed to be a dead zone on the calendar suddenly turned into a live issue nobody had prepared for. Multiple sources close to league operations have suggested that leadership learned about the release the same way everyone else did, by seeing it on social media. No early screening, no internal briefing, no chance to align messaging. In an industry where optics are tightly managed, that absence of awareness mattered more than the ad itself. It signaled that control hadn't just been challenged, it had been bypassed completely. And once that realization set in, there was no immediate way to reverse it. Team ownership, according to those same reports, wasn't celebrating either. From an owner's perspective, the math is brutal. The league's most valuable draw generates massive attention. Sponsors pour investment into her image, and yet franchise balance sheets see none of the upside. When a moment this large happens without any visible league participation, it forces uncomfortable questions. Where is the return on investment? How does this growth benefit the organizations carrying operational costs? And why does it feel like everyone is watching from the outside while the real value exchange happens elsewhere? What intensified the frustration was how visible the contrast became. The commercial didn't feel like a routine endorsement, it felt like a cultural event. And when owners compared that to the scale of league-backed campaigns, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. Fair or not, perception drives confidence, and the perception was that the biggest moment of the offseason didn't belong to the league at all.
Leadership also faced a secondary problem: precedent. If a major sponsor can operate independently like this once, what stops them from doing it again? What stops other brands from following the same template? And what message does that send to agents, players, and future stars watching how leverage actually works? These weren't hypothetical questions anymore. They were immediate concerns triggered by a single release that the league didn't control. There was also the internal dynamic no one likes to talk about publicly. Maintaining authority depends on the belief that authority exists. When decision-makers are visibly excluded from defining moments, that belief erodes quickly. Reports suggest some in leadership viewed this less as a marketing issue and more as a declaration, one that said approval was optional, not required. And that's a far more difficult problem to solve. By the end of the day, the issue wasn't Nike. It wasn't even the commercial. It was the realization that the league had been placed in a reactive position when it was accustomed to setting the tone. Once that shift happens, regaining control isn't about issuing statements or making calls. It's about confronting a structural change that can't be managed away. And that realization, more than anything else, is what reportedly made the fallout feel so intense. The shockwaves didn't stop at league offices. They rolled straight through locker rooms, training facilities, and private group chats across the league. Because moments like this don't exist in isolation. Athletes notice everything: how campaigns are framed, who gets elevated, and what kind of investment follows certain names. And when Caitlin Clark received a cinematic rollout that felt closer to a global entertainment launch than a traditional endorsement, comparisons were inevitable, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. For years, many established players have carried the league through leaner seasons. Championship runs, international play, consistent excellence, and long-term brand loyalty built the foundation that made this new era of attention possible. Those athletes weren't expecting equality in marketing, but they did expect proportional respect. That's why the contrast hit so hard. Clark's campaign didn't just look bigger, it felt different. More resources, more creativity, more belief. And in professional sports, belief is currency. What made the situation delicate is that this wasn't just about jealousy or ego, it was about messaging. When one athlete is framed as a transcendent figure, while others are promoted through routine, box-checking campaigns, it subtly reshapes how value is perceived. Sponsors follow perception. Media narratives follow perception. Even fans begin to unconsciously tier players based on how the industry treats them. That shift doesn't need to be fair to be powerful. It just needs to be visible. Reports from around the league suggest frustration had already been simmering long before Christmas. Questions about media access, marketing emphasis, and perceived favoritism had been floating quietly in the background all season. The Nike commercial didn't create those tensions, but it poured fuel on them. For athletes who had spent years delivering elite performance with comparatively modest exposure, watching a second-year player receive blockbuster treatment felt jarring, regardless of talent or popularity. There's also the endorsement hierarchy problem. Nike sponsors multiple WNBA athletes, including decorated champions and long-established stars. When one campaign looks like a tentpole global event and others resemble routine contractual obligations, it reshapes expectations. Athletes start reassessing their own leverage. Agents start asking harder questions. And suddenly, what was once an individual sponsorship issue becomes a league-wide conversation about who commands real influence. This ripple effect matters because leagues thrive on buy-in. When players believe the system rewards contribution fairly, stability follows. When they believe the system prioritizes visibility over longevity, cracks start forming. Every hard foul, every competitive exchange, every on-court clash becomes emotionally charged with off-court meaning. Fans might see competition, players feel context. And through it all, Caitlin Clark herself stayed largely silent, which only amplified the tension. The campaign spoke louder than any interview ever could. It showed what happens when the industry rallies around singular appeal instead of collective achievement. Whether that perception matches intent is almost irrelevant. In sports marketing, optics often matter more than explanations. By the time the conversation settled, one thing was clear. The commercial didn't just elevate one player, it redefined the league's internal temperature. And once that kind of shift sets in, it doesn't fade quietly. It lingers, reshaping relationships and expectations long after the ad stops playing. At some point, the conversation around that commercial stopped being about shoes, because what Nike appeared to be building felt much larger than a seasonal campaign or a delayed signature rollout. The scale, the casting, the visual language, it all suggested long-term positioning, not just for the next product drop, but for how Caitlin Clark is meant to be seen moving forward, less as a league star and more as a global property.
Observers across sports marketing circles have pointed out how deliberately the ad avoided basketball-specific framing. There was no heavy reliance on game footage, no emphasis on stats or wins, no attempt to ground her story exclusively inside the league ecosystem. Instead, the commercial leaned into cultural relevance, geography, and identity. It felt portable, flexible, designed to travel across borders and platforms without needing context. That's usually how brands treat entertainers and global ambassadors, not athletes whose value is tied to one competition structure. This is where speculation begins, and it's important to frame it clearly as analysis, not confirmation. Many industry analysts believe Nike is testing a ceiling. When a 30-second commercial generates more organic engagement than months of official league promotion, it forces a reassessment of strategy. Why constrain a marketable figure to league-approved channels when independent storytelling delivers faster, broader returns? Why limit reach when the audience has already proven it's willing to follow the individual anywhere? There's also the possibility that this is about future-proofing. Basketball careers are finite. Cultural relevance doesn't have to be. By positioning Clark as a cross-platform figure, someone who fits naturally alongside musicians, NFL stars, and international influencers, Nike appears to be laying groundwork beyond traditional endorsement arcs. That includes media projects, storytelling ventures, and entertainment-adjacent opportunities that don't depend on season schedules or collective bargaining constraints. The "From Anywhere" tagline deepened that interpretation. On the surface, it referenced Clark's on-court range and scoring ability, but branding experts were quick to note the layered meaning. Anywhere also suggests accessibility, flexibility, and global reach. It implies that her appeal isn't tied to a specific league, market, or system. That kind of phrasing is rarely accidental at this level of marketing. It opens doors rather than closes them. If this reading is even partially accurate, it explains why the moment felt so destabilizing for league leadership. Because it hints at a future where top-tier athletes don't just negotiate contracts, they negotiate ecosystems. Where exhibition games, independent showcases, international appearances, and media collaborations become as valuable as traditional competition. And where control shifts from institutions to individuals with proven audience pull. None of this means those plans are guaranteed or imminent, but the signal was unmistakable. Nike wasn't just responding to demand, they were shaping it. They showed what Clark could look like when presented without institutional framing. And once audiences see that version of a star, it changes expectations permanently. Because the question stops being, what can the league do with her? And starts becoming, how far can she go without it? The campaign was supposed to feel global. That much was clear from the moment it dropped. The visuals, the casting, the tone, it all suggested that Nike wasn't just speaking to American fans, they were speaking to the world. And it worked, at least at first. Almost immediately, international audiences started sharing the commercial, celebrating the moment, and reacting as if women's basketball had finally crossed an invisible cultural threshold. But that excitement didn't last long. Within hours, confusion began spreading online. Fans from Europe, Asia, and South America tried to engage with the product being advertised, only to hit a wall. Links didn't work, pages redirected, availability messages popped up, quietly informing viewers that the items they'd just been sold on weren't accessible in their region. What started as excitement quickly turned into frustration. Comment sections filled with the same question over and over again. How could a campaign feel so global, yet be so limited? That disconnect created a problem no one had planned for. According to reports, league officials were suddenly fielding complaints from fans who didn't differentiate between a brand campaign and the sport itself. To global audiences, this wasn't a Nike issue or a distribution issue. It was women's basketball promising something it couldn't deliver. And once again, the WNBA found itself pulled into damage control for a moment it hadn't orchestrated and couldn't fully manage. The optics were rough. On one hand, the sport was being marketed like a worldwide phenomenon. On the other, the infrastructure wasn't there to support that narrative. Fans who felt invited into the moment felt shut out just as quickly. And in the social media age, disappointment travels just as fast as hype. Screenshots circulated, posts went viral. The conversation shifted from celebration to criticism in a matter of hours. This placed leadership in a familiar but uncomfortable position. Another wave of attention had arrived before systems were ready to handle it. Another example of star-driven momentum outpacing organizational capacity. And while the frustration wasn't directed exclusively at the league, perception blurred those lines quickly. To fans, it didn't matter who controlled product rollout. What mattered was that the moment promised inclusivity and delivered restriction. It also reinforced a growing narrative. Clark's visibility had already surpassed the league's global structure. The appetite was there, the demand was real, but the pathways to meet that demand lagged behind. That gap doesn't just create annoyance, it exposes vulnerability.
It shows how fast individual influence can scale compared to collective systems that move more slowly by design.
By the end of the day, what should have been a universally positive breakthrough had morphed into yet another issue requiring explanations. Another instance where momentum outran preparation. And for leadership watching it unfold, the message was uncomfortable but clear. The audience is already global. The infrastructure just isn't. And when those two realities collide, the fallout rarely stays contained. There was a moment earlier in the season that didn't feel explosive at the time, but in hindsight, it became impossible to ignore. A carefully worded comment, a subtle suggestion about appreciation. Nothing aggressive, nothing overt, but enough to plant an idea in the public mind. The implication was simple. Stars benefit from the platform, and with that benefit comes a certain expectation of gratitude. At the time, it passed as standard league rhetoric. After Christmas morning, it landed very differently. Because the Nike commercial didn't respond with words, it didn't counter with interviews or social posts or defensive explanations, it responded with reality. Without addressing the comment directly, it rendered it irrelevant. Watching Caitlin Clark centered in a campaign of that scale reframed the entire conversation. The question quietly shifted from whether she should be thankful for the platform to whether the platform could maintain relevance without her gravitational pull. That's why the line aged so poorly, not because it was malicious, but because it assumed leverage that no longer existed. Gratitude implies dependence, and the Christmas release made it clear. Clark's value isn't contingent on institutional validation. Her audience follows her, not organizational messaging. Her cultural relevance doesn't require translation, and her commercial appeal doesn't pause waiting for approval. When those realities become visible, expectations rooted in old power dynamics collapse almost instantly. What made the shift even sharper was how calm it felt. There was no retaliation, no public conflict, no escalation. The commercial simply existed, and in doing so, exposed the imbalance. It showed what happens when an athlete's impact operates at a level institutions weren't designed to manage. The league wasn't undermined by confrontation, it was bypassed by momentum. This moment also clarified something many fans had sensed but couldn't articulate. The conversation around women's basketball was no longer about fitting individuals into the system, it was about whether the system could adapt quickly enough to stars who outgrew it in real time. Once that lens is applied, traditional expectations about loyalty and hierarchy start to feel outdated. Independent ventures, once dismissed as unrealistic, suddenly sounded rational. International showcases made sense. Media projects beyond league control felt inevitable. Alternative structures stopped feeling threatening and started feeling practical. None of this required anyone to say the quiet part out loud. The images did it instead. That's the irony. The statement about gratitude was meant to reinforce structure. The Nike commercial dismantled it without ever acknowledging it existed. And once viewers recognized that shift, there was no undoing it. Because when the conversation becomes less about permission and more about possibility, the balance of power doesn't just change, it flips. Christmas morning didn't create a crisis, it revealed one that had already been quietly forming. The reactions, the tension, the fallout, none of it came from a single commercial, it came from recognition. Recognition that the system was built for balance, not for a gravitational force powerful enough to bend everything toward itself. And Caitlin Clark has become exactly that force. The anger that reportedly followed wasn't really about marketing or coordination or even respect. It was about the realization that influence had already shifted, that audiences had made a choice long before leadership was ready to acknowledge it. Fans didn't need messaging to tell them who mattered. They followed the moments that felt authentic, electric, and unavoidable. And when those moments arrived without institutional framing, it didn't weaken them, it amplified them. For the WNBA, this is the crossroads no organization wants to face. Double down on collective structure and risk alienating the very attention driving growth, or adapt to a reality where individual stars hold unprecedented leverage.
Neither option is clean, neither is comfortable, but ignoring the shift isn't viable anymore, because once power becomes visible, it stops being theoretical. The irony is that the commercial didn't disrespect the league, it simply didn't need it, and that distinction matters. It showed what modern sports influence looks like when institutions move slower than audiences. When narratives aren't negotiated, they're decided in real time by engagement, attention, and cultural pull. That's not rebellion, that's evolution. Christmas was supposed to bring quiet. Instead, it delivered clarity. It exposed how fragile traditional structures become when they're asked to contain something they weren't designed to handle. The future of women's basketball won't be determined by statements or slogans or carefully managed press cycles. It will be shaped by whoever controls attention, and attention has already shown where it wants to go. The real question now isn't whether the league can regain control, it's whether control still matters in the way it used to. Because when one athlete can command the spotlight without asking for permission, the rules change permanently. And Christmas morning made one thing impossible to ignore: the next chapter won't wait politely for approval.